Hello again everyone from Tokyo, Japan, and welcome back to Japan Vintage Camera, where I'm coming to you again from Hinokicho Park, where it's a very nice early autumn day. My friend the duck happens to be hanging out not very far from where I'm sitting right now. I can see her sitting on her favorite rock, which is in the middle of the pond about 10 meters away from where I happen to be sitting right now. When she's not swimming around or begging for food, she happens to sit here and enjoy the sunshine and frolic with the other ducks when they happen to come by. I don't have anything for her to eat, so she's probably not going to come over here and pay a visit, so yeah, she's enjoying her time here at the park. The subject of today's video is going to be another Yashica rangefinder camera. This particular one is the Yashica Lynx 14. In my stores, I've received some comments and questions about this camera. A lot of people seem to be interested in acquiring one of these, and I don't often sell these because it's so difficult to find one which is in good condition. For those of you who are new to my channel, I sell vintage Japanese cameras on my online store, japanvintagecamera.com. I have an Etsy store which is also called Japan Vintage Camera, so if you're interested in buying this camera or another vintage Japanese camera, please visit one of my stores. I'll post links to my stores in the description below the video. So anyhow, yes, as I said, I've received a lot of interest in these cameras, but I haven't been able to come across any which I have considered, or I've deemed, I don't know, worthwhile to work on. When I buy cameras to resell, I usually try to find ones which are in fairly good condition, which don't require a lot in the way of repair or maintenance. Because I try to sell cameras for a very reasonable price, and cameras which require a lot more time and money to get them going are of course going to have to be sold for a higher amount of money. And in the case of certain cameras like the Electro 35 or Konica rangefinders or things like this, even the more difficult repairs are something which I can do fairly quickly. But on cameras like this, that's not the case. The Lynx 14 is a really wonderful camera if you can get one in working condition, but the if is the big problem. These cameras do have a couple of weaknesses which are very common. The most common issue is with the light meter in these cameras, which very seldom works. You can go through these things for hours trying to figure out why the light meter is working. This is mainly because of the use of the mercury batteries in these cameras, and the fumes from the mercury batteries happen to corrode the wiring, and they also happen to get into the switch and corrode the switch, and often they travel as far as the light meter itself and cause corrosion problems with the light meter. In the case of this camera, I was quite lucky. This camera actually works. It has a working light meter, and of the 6 or 7 of these cameras I've come across over the last decade or so, this is the second one to have a working light meter, so that gives you an idea of what a rare thing that is. Another issue these cameras have is that the shutter tends to get oily and gummed up and often sticks. It will either not open when you push the shutter button, or it will open partially, or it will open and then decide not to close. And this issue is mainly like a storage related issue. Most of these cameras were sold in Japan, and most of them are kind of subject to the climate here, which is quite cold and dry in the winter and quite hot and humid in the summer. Japanese people tend to be very frugal when it comes to using things like heat and air conditioning. And in the winter, the best heater is simply to wear more clothes, and in the summertime, wearing less clothes and using a paper fan is the most popular form of air conditioning here. And though Japanese people seem to get by well enough with these kind of old school ways of staying warm and cool, cameras are not so accepting of this kind of treatment. When it gets really hot here in the summertime and these cameras are left someplace where they get hot, the heat softens up the oil and lubricants in the shutter mechanism and causes it to move around, and it usually finds its way to the shutter blades and aperture blades, which are quite hard to clean in this camera. Another thing which happens with these is there are contacts in the aperture and shutter speed rings, which vary the resistance as you turn the rings, and as the resistance varies, the needle moves. When the needle moves to the center of the meter, it means that you have the correct combination of shutter and aperture and you can take the photo. But when these contacts get corroded or contaminated, the needle may not move properly, or it may move or shake or be twitchy or something like that. So that's another problem they have. So other than that, other than the shutter mechanism and the light meter mechanism, the rest of the camera is solid and really well built. It's basically like a Lynx or Minister camera with just a larger lens put on, and pretty much the same light meter system as you find on like the Minister 700. Let's go ahead and take a look at the features, functions, and close details of the Lynx 14, starting at the top. Here we have this wonderful film rewind knob, which is pretty much the same thing you find on the Yashica Electro 35. Here you find a shoe for mounting a flash gun. Of course, this isn't a hot shoe. If you're going to use a flash on one of these cameras, you'll find a PC sync socket located on the side here, in the same position you'll find on an Electro 35. Moving further over, we'll come to the light meter window, which has kind of this magnifying glass on top so you can see it more carefully. And it says over and under, and the goal is to adjust the aperture and shutter speeds in a particular way while depressing the light meter button until the light meter needle lines up in the center. When that happens, then you are good to go and take a photograph. Next to that, we have the shutter release button, which accepts a standard cable release. And here we have a film winding and shutter charging lever, which is kind of the same which we find on the earlier Yashica Electro 35 cameras. On the back of the camera, there's pretty much nothing back here except for the viewfinder eyepiece, which is another Electro 35 kind of item. Moving to the front of the camera, we have the viewfinder window, the rangefinder window, and this kind of matte glass here, which diffuses the light which goes on the projected frame lines. So this camera has frame lines very similar to the Electro 35 with the parallax correction and all that, but they have this kind of block out thing in the top center as you look through the light meter, and this is supposed to allow you to see the light meter needle when it's working properly. And next to that, of course, we have the light meter photo cell. The CDS light meters were supposed to be a big improvement over the earlier selenium light meters, but in these early cameras which were fitted with these meters, they have problems due to the corrosion. Moving to the lens here, as this is a fixed lens rangefinder camera, all the important controls are on the lens body. At the very bottom we have the focusing ring, and we have a series of green numbers on the top here, which lets you see your focus distance in both meters and feet. In front of that we have a depth of field scale, which shows how much depth of field you have at any given aperture. And a kind of interesting and unique thing that this camera has, which many others don't, is a setting for infrared film. For those of you who aren't aware, when you are shooting with infrared film, the focus distance is different. So if you focus using the rangefinder in the camera, or when it shows focused in the viewfinder of an SLR, if you're using infrared film, it's not going to be focused properly, and you have to compensate by turning the focusing ring just a little bit. Infrared film is a lot of fun. In most cases, for myself, I enjoy shooting it with it. I've had a lot of fun, mainly with like the Rolei IR 400 films. These are really interesting when you shoot them because they provide like really interesting images. The clouds turn bright white, the blue skies turn black. Things which are in the shadows and darkness tend to come out. It's really cool to shoot with this film. However, it's a little bit difficult because though it's like the listed film speed is 400, I usually shoot it at something like ISO 12. And because I have to use like a really thick and opaque infrared filter on it. And this of course requires really, really long shutter speed times. And if you can compute all this stuff manually, with a handheld light meter, you can use infrared film in a camera like this, but for myself, I wouldn't try it because I don't think I would get a lot of good results. My favorite kit for shooting infrared film is my OM4 tie, my Olympus, because it has automatic exposure, which works well and for really long exposures. So it's kind of an interesting thing for those of you who are into film or haven't tried it before and you have an AE capable camera. I would recommend trying infrared film. You might be surprised at the results you get. For infrared film, I should do a separate video about that. I think that's a good idea for in the future, but the best time to use this kind of film is in the midsummer when you get the most infrared light, then you'll get the most infrared effect. And also for it to work really good, you should have a lot of greenery and green plants like you find in midsummer. In the winter, you'll get pretty interesting effects without any filters at all. But anyway, let's go ahead and continue. In front of the depth of field scale, we have this lever here, which is what you use to adjust the film speed. And we have a film speed range of ISO 10 all the way up to 800, or ASA 10 to 800, depending on your preference, which is suitable for the kind of film we have on the market today. In front of that, we have the aperture lever, and of course, as this is the Lynx 14, the fastest aperture is f1.4. In front of that, we have the shutter speed ring, which has a full range of shutter speeds from 1 second to 1/500th a second plus bulb. And in the front here, we have the lens filter ring, which is a 58mm, which is kind of an oddball. Yashica has a lot of different variations in their filters, but the 58mm seems to be the hardest to find. The Electro 35 series, the full-size ones, were all like say 55mm, 52mm for cameras like the GX and CCN, and then like GTs and GSs came with a kind of a rubber filter which folded back, and those have like a 62mm filter. But the filter for this particular camera or lens hood is quite hard to find. Well, the original ones are anyway. So yeah, pretty cool. On the front here, we have a setting here for manual or the X sync speed, and then we have a self-timer lever here on this side. Please do not use the self-timers on these cameras because, as I've said before in previous videos, they're very fragile and failure prone. And if it goes bad, most people don't have the skill to either repair them or remove them from the camera so they can use it again. So do yourself a favor and don't use it. If you need to take long exposures, you can get a simple wind down self-timer, the kind that you screw into the shutter button here. You turn the dial on the self-timer and push the button on it, and then that works perfectly well. On the bottom of the camera, we have the battery cap here, which is the same cap which comes on the Electro 35, a standard 1/4" tripod socket, which is wonderfully located exactly in the center instead of some other odd position like they often use in other cameras. Here we have the release button for the winding mechanism, so you can rewind the film. Loading the film in the camera is quite simple. Like the Electro 35, this has a pop-up, or mistake in there, has a lever on the bottom. I'm thinking too much about the Electro 35 and I'm getting myself confused here. But on the inside of the back, you can see this one's a little bit dirty on the inside. I haven't had a chance to get in here and clean this one up yet. We have the film canister chamber on this side. We have the take-up spool on this side. Over here, like on the earlier Electros, we have a conversion table, so you can convert from the old DIN standard to the new ISO or ASA standard. Loading the film is quite simple. Simply push up on the spool here, the fork, drop your film canister inside, push this back down, pull your film across, and feed it into the slot on the take-up spool, and simply wind the film and keep winding it until it's pulled across the take-up spool here. And when the teeth in the take-up spool are lined up with the holes on the film, you can close the door and wind the film and fire the shutter until the number 1 lines up here in the window and the camera is ready to go. So anyway, that's it for my review of the Yashica Lynx 14. I hope you enjoyed it. As I said, I plan to be listing this camera for sale shortly in my online stores, so if you're interested, please check back. The weekend is coming up. I plan to have a lot more things listed for this weekend, so sales have been really good recently. It's kind of hard for me to keep up with the demand, so everyone out there, thank you very much. Shipping is a little bit slower recently due to the Silver Week holiday we had last week. A lot of things were shut down during Silver Week, and this caused a lot of delays in shipping and things like that. But things are back up to speed this week, so all of you who have ordered things should start receiving them this week or later next week. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you tune in again soon.